Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Silas Vance laughed as he tossed Elena Vance's hand-drafted blueprints onto the buffet table, right into a puddle of spilled burgundy sauce, in front of the city's most influential developers. The sound of the heavy vellum hitting the mahogany was muffled by the collective gasp of the socialites gathered for the Vance architecture firm's 50th anniversary. "A hobbyist's effort," Silas declared, his voice booming across the marble foyer of the Vance Plaza. He didn't look at his daughter as he spoke. He looked at the crowd, playing to the cameras. "Fortunately, my son Leo has refined these amateur sketches into the masterpiece you see on the monitors tonight. The New Heights Tower is officially his vision." Elena stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her modest navy dress. The smell of expensive lilies and floor wax felt suffocating in the heat of the gala. She watched the dark, oily sauce seep into the paper, the plans she had spent 4 months perfecting, working until 3 in the morning while her brother, Leo Vance, was out at the clubs. Leo stood beside their father now, adjusting his silk tie with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He hadn't even looked at the site plans until 10 minutes ago, yet there he was, basking in the glow of the overhead projectors. The room was a sea of status symbols. Beatrice Vance, her stepmother, glided over, the diamonds at her throat catching the light like jagged ice. She didn't offer a hand or a kind word. Instead, she adjusted the strap of Elena's dress with a sharp, condescending tug that nearly bared Elena's shoulder to the room. "You should have worn the Chanel I sent over, dear," Beatrice whispered, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby senator's wife to hear. "This, whatever this is, makes you look like the help. It's embarrassing for Silas to have you standing here looking so common." Elena felt the heat rising in her chest, a familiar burn she had suppressed for years. She reached into her small clutch, her fingers brushing against a cold, metallic object, an encrypted flash drive. It was a secret weight, a silent promise. Silas thought he had wiped the servers of her initial iterations, the ones that carried her unique digital signature and the structural calculations Leo couldn't even read, let alone invent. He was wrong. She had been a sleeping lion in this house for too long, providing the brilliance that kept the Vance name prestigious while they treated her like a ghost. Julian Thorne stood near the bar, watching the exchange. He wasn't dressed in the usual ostentatious tuxedo. His suit was charcoal, well-cut but lacking the visible brand names the others flaunted. To the room, he was just a carpenter, the man Silas had hired to finish the mahogany detailing in the penthouse. Silas treated him like furniture, but Julian's eyes were sharp, tracking the power shift in the room with a focus that didn't belong to a simple laborer. "To the future of Vance architecture," Silas shouted, raising a crystal flute of vintage champagne. "To my heir Leo, the true visionary." The room erupted in applause. Elena watched as the developers she had interviewed, the engineers she had commanded, and the city officials she had lobbied all turned their backs on her to shake Leo's hand. The sound of their laughter was like the clinking of the ice in Silas's glass, cold, sharp, and expensive. Leo looked at her over the shoulder of a prominent investor, his expression one of bored triumph. He leaned in and whispered something to Silas, and her father's face hardened. "Elena," Silas barked, finally turning his gaze toward her. He didn't see a daughter, he saw an inconvenient truth. "The catering staff is short-handed in the West Wing. Since you've finished your contribution for the evening, go make yourself useful. Someone spilled a tray of hors d'oeuvres near the service entrance. Clean it up." The silence that followed was thick. A few people nearby looked away, uncomfortable with the blatant cruelty but unwilling to challenge the mogul. Elena felt a strange, chilling clarity. The rage that usually simmered was gone, replaced by a crystalline resolve. She looked at Silas, really looked at him, noticing the sagging skin beneath his expensive tan and the desperation in the way he clutched his glass. He wasn't a king. He was a scavenger living off her talent. "I'll see to it, father," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that didn't tremble. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic military beat against the white marble. She didn't head for the service entrance. She headed for the shadows of the mezzanine where Julian was waiting. As she passed him, she didn't stop, but her hand brushed his. "Is the bypass ready?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Waiting for your signal," Julian replied, his voice a deep anchor in the sea of noise. "The moment you upload, the board gets the unedited files. He won't be able to hide the theft." Elena glanced back at the gala one last time. The lights were bright, the champagne was flowing, and Silas was laughing, unaware that the foundation of his world was built on the very woman he had just ordered to mop the floor. She touched the drive in her pocket, feeling the cold edges of her revenge. Silas Vance wanted a legacy. She was going to give him one he would never forget. She stepped into the darkened office, the glow of the computer monitor reflecting in her eyes. It was time to show the world who really built the Vance empire. Her finger hovered over the enter key. One click, and the golden anniversary would become a wake. The next morning, the executive suite smelled of expensive roast coffee and the sharp, clinical scent of lemon polish. Elena Vance moved with practiced silence, her cloth circling the edge of the conference table until the dark mahogany shone like a mirror. She was a shadow in the room, a fixture Silas Vance had long ago learned to look through rather than at. To him, she wasn't a daughter or an architect. She was a reminder of a debt he never intended to pay. The heavy oak doors swung open, and he marched in, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. Behind him trailed Leo, looking rumpled and smelling faintly of the previous night's celebration. Silas didn't even glance at her as he tossed a thick leather portfolio onto the table. Elena recognized the gold-embossed edges instantly. It was the master plan for the harbor redevelopment, her life's work, the project she had spent 3 years perfecting in the dead of night, while Silas claimed she was merely helping with the filing. "It's yours now, Leo," Silas said, his voice booming with a terrifying, unearned pride. "I've scrubbed her name from the digital signatures. As of 9 o'clock this morning, you are the lead architect of the Vance Legacy Project." Leo Vance smirked, leaning back in a leather chair that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. He ran a hand through his hair, looking at the blueprints as if he could actually read them. "Thanks, Dad. It's about time this family had a real visionary at the helm again. People were starting to wonder why we were letting a girl handle the heavy lifting." He spared a dismissive glance toward Elena, who was currently polishing a nearby sideboard. "You missed a spot on the corner, sis. Try to focus." "It's the only job you're actually qualified for." The rage was a cold, hard knot in Elena's chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She simply tucked the cloth into her pocket and moved toward the sideboard to refresh their water. Her fingers brushed the small, encrypted device in her pocket. The upload she'd triggered the night before was already working its way through the company's internal servers like a silent, righteous virus. Silas thought he had scrubbed her name, but he didn't realize she had embedded her signature into the very metadata of the files. "The board is expecting a full presentation on Friday," Silas continued, ignoring the woman standing 3 feet away. "They want to see the Vance touch. Make sure you memorize the structural load calculations. We can't have you looking like an idiot in front of the investors." "Don't worry," Leo chuckled, pouring himself a glass of the water Elena had just set down. "If I get stuck, I'll just tell them the help forgot to print the right pages. They'll eat it up." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Elena's skin crawl. "That's my boy. Remember, in this world, there are those who build empires and those who mop the floors. Know which one you are, and you'll never be disappointed." He turned his back to her, staring out the window at the city skyline he believed he owned. He didn't see the way Elena's eyes sharpened. He didn't know that Martha Higgins had called her at dawn, her voice trembling as she confessed the truth about the Vance inheritance. The lie Silas had used to strip Elena of her mother's trust was finally unraveling. Martha had promised to hand over the original documents, the ones that proved the Vance building itself didn't belong to Silas at all. 48 hours, Leo," Silas said, his reflection in the glass looking like a king presiding over a crumbling kingdom. "The anniversary gala was just the beginning. Friday is when we cement our place in history." Elena stepped toward the door, her pace measured and calm. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to scream. She had the truth and she had the data. "I'll be there," she said softly, her hand on the brass handle. Silas didn't even turn around. "Of course you will. Someone has to clear the glasses after the toast. Just make sure you wear something that doesn't look like it came from a thrift store. You're a Vance, even if you are a disappointment." She exited the room, the heavy door clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a gavel. In the quiet of the hallway, she pulled out her phone. A single notification glowed on the screen. Data transfer 100% complete. Recipients: Internal Audit, Beatrice Vance, and the New York Ledger. The countdown had begun. Silas Vance had 48 hours left of being a king, and Elena was the one who was going to pull the rug out from under his throne. She touched the drive in her pocket one last time, a ghost of a smile appearing on her lips. Friday wasn't just a presentation, it was a funeral. The following afternoon, the air in the workshop smelled of raw pine and beeswax, a sharp contrast to the suffocating floral scents of the Vance estate. Elena Vance stood by the heavy oak workbench, watching as Julian Thorne navigated a complex web of spreadsheets on a rugged laptop. The rhythmic rasp of a plane against wood from a nearby apprentice provided a steady, grounding heartbeat to the room. Julian didn't look like a man who held the keys to a financial empire. He wore a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his forearms dusted with sawdust, but his eyes were sharp with a terrifyingly precise intelligence. He tapped a key, and a series of wire transfers highlighted in jagged red lines filled the screen. "He wasn't just skimming, Elena," Julian said, his voice low and steady. He pointed to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. "Silas has been draining the Vance Global Pension Fund to cover his losses in the Dubai waterfront collapse. He's been moving the money through Leo's accounts to keep his own hands clean." Elena felt a cold shiver of realization. It wasn't just greed, it was a scorched earth policy. Her father was willing to sacrifice his own son's legal standing to preserve his image as a king. She touched the small, encrypted drive sitting on the workbench. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. "Does it link back to him directly?" she asked. "Every cent," Julian confirmed, finally looking up. His gaze was intense, offering a silent support that she hadn't felt in years. "The ledger Martha Higgins kept for your mother, the one Silas thought he burned, it matches these digital footprints perfectly. He's not just a failing mogul, he's a felon." 2 days, she whispered, the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs. "He thinks Friday is his coronation. He's invited the entire board and the press to witness his legacy expansion." "Then let him have his audience," Julian said. "The higher he climbs, the more air he'll lose on the way down." An hour later, Elena entered the glass and steel monolith of Vance Global. The transition was jarring. The biting chill of the executive floor's HVAC system felt like stepping into a tomb. As she walked toward her father's office, the rhythmic, annoying click of a gold pen echoed down the hallway. She found Leo Vance sprawled in one of the designer leather chairs in the reception area. He looked up, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his silk tie. He looked every bit the favored son, draped in unearned luxury, while Elena still wore her practical work boots and a coat that had seen better winters. "Back for more, Elena?" Leo asked, clicking the pen again. The sound was like a physical peck at her nerves. "I heard Silas gave you a job for the gala." "Don't worry, I'll tell the caterers to let you have the leftover shrimp. It's probably better than the canned soup you're used to." Elena didn't flinch. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the puppet strings he was too arrogant to notice. "You should check your personal filings, Leo. Arrogance is a poor shield against a paper trail." Leo laughed, a harsh, entitled sound. "My filings are handled by the best. Unlike your little architectural career, my future is guaranteed. Silas told me this morning that I'm being named managing director on Friday. You're just a footnote in the Vance history books, and a messy one at that." The door to the inner sanctum swung open, and Silas Vance stepped out. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who believed he had already won. He didn't look at Elena at first. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the harsh fluorescent light. Leo, go check on the ledger reporters. I want them primed for the announcement, Silas commanded. He finally turned his gaze to Elena, his eyes like flint. And you, I hope you've spent the morning finding something respectable to wear. I won't have you looking like a vagrant while I'm being photographed. I'm here to confirm the presentation sequence, Silas, Elena said, her voice a calm, flat line. The sequence is simple, he snapped, stepping into her personal space. The smell of his expensive, cloying cologne, the same scent her mother used to say gave her headaches, filled the gap between them. I speak. The board votes. You stand in the background and look grateful that I haven't stripped your name from the building yet. You're a liability I'm choosing to tolerate for the sake of optics. Don't mistake my pragmatism for affection. He reached out, his hand gripping her shoulder with a bruising force that he masked as a fatherly pat for anyone watching. Friday is about the survival of this family. If you do anything to embarrass me, I will ensure you never work in this city again. I'll make sure your name is synonymous with failure. Elena looked him directly in the eye. She didn't pull away. She felt the encrypted drive in her pocket, a secret power that made his threats sound like the desperate howling of a dying animal. I understand perfectly, she said. I'll make sure the presentation is something no one will ever forget. You'll get exactly the legacy you've earned. Silas grunted, satisfied by what he perceived as her submission. He turned back to his office, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. See that you do. Now get out. I have an empire to run. As Elena walked toward the elevators, she passed a mirror in the lobby. She didn't see the disappointment Silas described. She saw a woman who had spent years learning how to build structures that could withstand any storm. And she knew that the foundation Silas had built his life upon wasn't made of stone. It was made of lies, and she was the one holding the match. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft, final chime. 48 hours. The countdown had moved from days to heartbeats. Elena Vance was standing on a pedestal of glass, and Elena was finally ready to throw the first stone. The morning before the Vance Foundation's 30th anniversary gala, the air in the city felt heavy, like the static before a lightning strike. Elena Vance spent the early hours in the only sanctuary Silas's influence couldn't penetrate, Julian's workshop. The rhythmic rasp of a hand plane against a slab of raw walnut provided a steady heartbeat to her racing thoughts. Julian Thorne didn't ask questions. He simply worked, his strong hands guiding the tool with a precision her father would never understand. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm, and glanced at the heavy manila envelope resting on his workbench. "You're sure about this, Elena?" he asked, his voice low and grounding. She touched the edge of the paper, feeling the slight grit of the old documents Martha Higgins had risked everything to pull from the archives. "He thinks he can build a legacy on a hollow floor," she said. "I'm just the one pointing out the structural failure." Julian stepped closer, the scent of fresh cedar and wood shavings clinging to him. He was a man of few words, but the way he looked at her, not as a disappointment or an asset, but as an equal, gave her more strength than 1,000 of her father's board meetings. He handed her a small, sleek thumb drive. "The digital backups are encrypted. If the physical copies disappear during the event, this will trigger the backup servers." She tucked the drive into her pocket, the cold metal feeling like a live wire against her thigh. "Thank you, Julian." Their quiet moment was shattered by the shrill, desperate screech of tires on the gravel outside. A neon-orange Italian sports car, a vehicle that cost more than most people's homes, skidded to a halt in the workshop's modest lot. Leo Vance stepped out, his designer loafers clicking arrogantly on the dirt. He adjusted his sunglasses, smelling of cloying, expensive cologne and unearned confidence. "Dad wants to know if the disappointment is finally ready for her close-up," Leo sneered, leaning against a stack of Julian's hand-carved beams. He didn't notice the way Julian's jaw tightened or the dangerous stillness in the room. "You know, Elle, it's cute that you think these little drawings and site visits matter. Tomorrow is about the Vance legacy. It's about me taking my rightful place at the helm. You're just the window dressing for the real show." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him, her gaze remaining on the workbench. "You're right, Leo. Tomorrow is exactly about the legacy Sela's built. I hope you're both ready for everyone to see it clearly." Leo barked a laugh, a shallow, grating sound. "Whatever, just make sure the slides look professional. Don't embarrass us more than you already have by hanging out in a shed." He shot a look of pure contempt at Julian, before spinning on his heel and roaring back out of the lot, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. By late afternoon, Elena stood in the hushed, sterile luxury of the Vance Global headquarters. Silas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, staring out at the skyline as if he'd personally placed every brick. The cold condensation on his Scotch glass left a wet, mocking ring on the antique mahogany desk. He didn't turn around when she entered. "The presentation is locked," she said, her voice a calm, steady blade. "I've included the archival data Martha Higgins recovered. It adds a necessary perspective to the Foundation's history." Silas chuckled, a dry sound that lacked any real warmth. "Martha is a relic, Elena, just like those old files. You have a habit of looking backward when you should be looking at the throne. Nobody cares about the history of how the stone was quarried. They care about the man who owns the mountain. A foundation built on a lie eventually collapses under its own weight, Silas," she said, her eyes fixed on the back of his expensive, tailored suit. "I hope you're prepared for the truth to be fully exposed tomorrow." He finally turned, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Then it's a good thing I built mine on gold and blood. My foundation is unbreakable. Now go. Get your hair done, buy a dress that doesn't scream architect, and try to look like a Vance for once." Elena left the office without another word. As she walked through the lobby, the sunset hit the glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floor. Only 18 hours remained. The evidence was secured, the witnesses were invited, and the man who thought he was a god was far too arrogant to notice the cracks forming beneath his feet. The countdown hadn't just reached its final day. It had reached the point of no return. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy wouldn't just be celebrated, it would be judged. The evening arrived with a suffocating sense of grandeur. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom of the Vance Plaza had been transformed into a cathedral of glass and gold, illuminated by chandeliers that cast sharp, diamond-like fractured light across the marble floors. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of thousands of white lilies, Silas's favorite flower, chosen specifically because they smelled like a funeral for anyone who dared to oppose him. Silas Vance stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a phalanx of investors and city officials. He looked every bit the king of the mountain, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He laughed, a booming, practiced sound that didn't reach his eyes, while his hands moved with the restless energy of a man who believed he owned the very air the guests were breathing. He was in his element, holding court and basking in the sycophantic praise of men who feared his bank account more than they respected his character. Elena Vance entered the ballroom 20 minutes late. She didn't slip in through the side entrance as she usually did, hoping to remain invisible. Instead, she walked through the main gilded doors, her heels clicking against the stone with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She wasn't wearing the modest, muted tones Silas had demanded. She had ignored his order to look like a Vance, and instead chose to look like a storm. Her gown was a deep, midnight blue silk that shimmered with every step, the fabric feeling cool and heavy against her skin, a tactile reminder of the cold resolve she had cultivated over the last 48 hours. She felt the weight of the small, silver flash drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her clutch. It was a tiny thing, no larger than a lipstick, yet it contained enough digital gunpowder to level the building they were standing in. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," a voice sneered from her left. Leo Vance stumbled toward her, a glass of vintage scotch gripped in a hand that was already trembling. His bow tie was slightly crooked, and his eyes were glazed with the dangerous combination of unearned confidence and high-end alcohol. He looked at his sister with a mixture of resentment and mocking amusement. "Nice dress, Elena. A bit much for a consultant, don't you think?" He leaned in closer, the the smell of expensive peat and entitlement rolling off him in waves. I talked to Dad. He's announcing the new waterfront project tonight. My firm is taking the lead. You're being moved to the archives department starting Monday. He thinks your talents are better suited for filing away the past rather than building the future. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply watched a bead of condensation drip down the side of his glass. The archives, Leo, that's interesting. I've spent a lot of time in the records lately. It's amazing what stays buried when no one is looking. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the lack of fear in her voice. Whatever. Just stay out of the way when the cameras start flashing. This is a night for the winners, not the help. He brushed past her, nearly colliding with a waiter, his arrogance so thick it was almost a physical barrier. Elena moved deeper into the room, her gaze sweeping the crowd. In the far corner, standing near a towering ice sculpture, she saw a man who looked entirely out of place despite his perfectly tailored suit. Julian Thorne caught her eye from across the sea of silk and diamonds. He didn't wave or smile. He simply gave a single, slow nod. He was the silent partner in this dance, the man who had provided the final pieces of the puzzle, and seeing him there provided a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. He was the only one in the room who knew that the floor beneath Silas's feet was already beginning to liquefy. Near the head table, Martha Higgins sat stiffly, her weathered hands clutching a lace handkerchief. She looked like a ghost at a feast. When she saw Elena, her lips parted as if to speak, but she quickly looked away, her shoulders hunched under the weight of the secrets she had finally surrendered. The guilt in the room was palpable, a low-frequency hum that Elena could feel in her teeth. The quartet stopped playing, and a hush fell over the ballroom as Silas stepped onto the podium. The spotlight hit him, turning his silver hair into a halo. He gripped the edges of the lectern, looking out over the crowd with a predatory glint in his eyes. "Friends, colleagues, family," Silas began, his voice amplified and commanding. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate 40 years of the Vance legacy. We celebrate the future. A future built on the values I have instilled in this company since the day I laid the first brick: loyalty, strength, and an unbreakable foundation." Elena began to move. She didn't go toward the stage. She moved toward the technician's booth hidden behind a velvet curtain at the rear of the hall. The young man operating the AV system looked up, startled, as she stepped into his space. "Can I help you, Ms. Vance?" he whispered, his eyes darting to the monitors. "There's been a change to the presentation," she said, her voice like ice. She reached into her bag and pulled out the drive. "My father wants the legacy video played instead of the promotional reel. Now." The technician hesitated, looking toward Silas, who was currently mid-sentence, bragging about the integrity of his financial empire. "He's about to call for the toast," Elena prompted, her gaze fixed on her father's back. "If that video isn't ready when he hits the button, it's your job on the line, not mine." The young man swallowed hard and took the drive. On stage, Silas was reaching his crescendo. He gestured for Leo to join him, pulling his son into the light. "I have spent my life building a name that means something. And tonight, I am proud to announce that the Vance legacy will continue through my heir, who will lead us into our greatest era yet." He reached for the remote on the podium, his thumb hovering over the button that was supposed to trigger a montage of his greatest achievements. He looked out at the audience, his face flushed with the ultimate high of public adoration. Elena stood perfectly still in the shadows of the booth. She watched the back of his head, the man who had stolen her mother's peace and her own future, and she felt a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. "And now," Silas shouted, his voice ringing with triumph, "let the world see what a Vance is truly made of." He pressed the button. The giant screens flanking the stage flickered, but instead of the soaring music and golden-hued images of skyscrapers, the room was suddenly filled with the grainy, high-contrast image of a ledger, and a voice, distorted but unmistakable, beginning to speak. Elena leaned against the cold metal of the server rack, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum. The face slap hadn't landed yet, but the hand was already in the air. Silas turned toward the screen, his smile beginning to curdle into a mask of confusion. The countdown had ended. The judgment had begun. The distorted audio smoothed out, the digital hiss vanishing to reveal the crisp, unmistakable voice of Martha Higgins. It wasn't a speech. It was a confession. The giant screens flanking the stage didn't show the Vance family crest or the sweeping vistas of their real estate empire. Instead, a series of scanned bank ledgers from 2018 flickered into view, the numbers glowing with a cold, predatory light. "Silas told me to bury the accounts," Martha's voice echoed through the ballroom, sounding larger than life. "He said Elena didn't need to know about her mother's trust. He said the girl was too soft to handle the weight of that much capital. So we moved it. 3 offshore transfers, hidden under the guise of the Hudson Development Project." The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the 500 guests. The clinking of silverware stopped. The smell of expensive lilies and floor wax seemed to sharpen, turned acrid by the sudden surge of ozone from the massive server racks behind Elena. She stood in the darkness of the control booth, her fingers resting lightly on the cool metal of the master fader. She could see the back of Silas's head from here, the rigid posture, the expensive tailoring of his tuxedo, and she watched as the first tremor took hold of his shoulders. Silas Vance turned toward the screen, his smile beginning to curdle into a mask of confusion that rapidly devolved into raw, naked panic. He lunged for the podium microphone, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Turn it off," he barked, his voice cracking, the sound amplified and distorted. "This is a prank, a deepfake. Security, shut the power down now." But the face slap was only beginning. As the next slide appeared, a sign directive with Silas's unmistakable, aggressive flourish. The color didn't just leave his face. It seemed to be sucked out by a physical force, leaving his skin the gray-white of wet ash. His eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, became wide and glassy, darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling with a silent, pathetic rhythm that made him look 100 years old in the span of a few seconds. The sweat began to bead at his temples, oily and thick, reflecting the harsh blue light of the screens that were systematically dismantling his legacy. His chest hitched in shallow, jagged gasps, his hand clawing at the mahogany podium as if the wood could somehow anchor him to the reality he had just lost. In the front row, Beatrice Vance stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as if to physically hold back a scream of betrayal. Beside her, Leo Vance looked smaller than he ever had, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the board members who were already whispering like a swarm of angry hornets. The board chair, a man who had backed Silas for decades, leaned forward with his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line, his eyes narrow as he memorized every incriminating figure on the screen. Julian Thorne remained still in the shadows near the buffet, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left the booth where Elena was hidden. "Is that a deepfake too, Silas?" Elena's voice suddenly cut through the room, projected through the high-fidelity speakers. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was as calm and cold as a winter morning. "The signature is verified. The accounts are traced. You didn't just steal my mother's peace. You stole the future of every person in this room to cover your own incompetence." Silas staggered back from the podium, his foot catching on a stray cable. He looked out at the crowd, seeing not the adoration he craved, but the cold, clinical judgment of his peers. The people who had laughed at his jokes 10 minutes ago were now pulling their chairs away, creating a physical void around the Vance family table. Elena stepped out from the shadows of the booth and onto the small balcony overlooking the hall. She looked down at the man who had spent a lifetime trying to make her feel small. "You always said a Vance is made of steel and secrets, Silas," she said, her voice carrying to the very back of the room. "It turns out the steel was stolen, and the secrets are out." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him crumble further or listen to the frantic explanations he was trying to stammer to the board chair. Elena turned her back on the stage, the heavy velvet curtains of the booth swinging shut behind her. As she walked toward the service exit, the sound of the first police sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the stunned silence of the gala. The hand was no longer in the air. The blow had landed, and the world Elena Vance had built was already in pieces. The silence that followed the sirens was more deafening than the gala's orchestra had ever been. Elena Vance stood frozen on the stage, the projection of his forged signatures still glowing behind him like a neon indictment. He looked at the board members, his chest heaving under a tuxedo that suddenly seemed 3 sizes too small. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, thick with the smell of expensive lilies and the sudden, sharp scent of ozone from the storm breaking outside. "This is a fabrication," he roared, his voice cracking as it hit the high vaulted ceiling. He pointed a trembling finger toward the service exit where his daughter had just disappeared. "She's a disgruntled child, a failed architect trying to burn down the house she couldn't build." He slammed his fist onto the mahogany lectern, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Security, remove these displays. Someone find her and bring her back here to apologize." But the security team didn't move. They stood at the perimeter of the room, their eyes fixed on the floor. Beatrice Vance didn't look at him with her usual submissive devotion either. She stood at the edge of the VIP table, her hand gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles turned the color of the pearls around her neck. Beside her, Leo looked like he wanted to crawl under the tablecloth. The favored son didn't step up to defend his father. He simply turned his back, staring at his own reflection in a polished silver tray with a look of dawning horror. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. It wasn't just the police. Julian Thorne walked in, his usual carpenter's flannel replaced by a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of old money. Behind him followed a woman in a sharp navy blazer, the district attorney. Martha Higgins walked alongside them, clutching a weathered leather ledger to her chest like a shield. Silas lunged toward the edge of the stage, his eyes wild. "You!" he hissed, spotting the ledger. "You old drunk, give me that. You've been bitter since the day I fired you for your incompetence." He reached out as if to snatch the book, his fingers clawing the air. Julian stepped forward, placing himself firmly between the stage and the elderly woman. "Don't touch her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The calm authority in his tone caused a ripple of whispers to break out among the guests. "The game is over. The DA has the original filings from the 1994 merger, the ones you thought were lost in the office fire." The lead detective stepped onto the stage. The sound of his boots on the hollow wood was a rhythmic thud, marking the seconds of a reign reaching its end. He produced a pair of steel handcuffs, the metal catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Silas tried to retreat, but his back hit the projector screen. He was trapped against the very evidence of his own greed. Silas's face underwent a violent transformation. The arrogance that usually sat there like a throne collapsed into a ruin of twitching muscles and graying skin. His lower lip trembled, revealing the jagged edge of a tooth he'd chipped years ago, and a bead of cold sweat tracked a path through the expensive foundation he wore to hide his age. The man who had once looked like a titan now looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a loophole that no longer existed. His skin took on a sickly, sallow hue, and his shoulders, usually held with military posture, slumped forward as if the weight of his lies had finally gained physical mass. "Wait," he stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Beatrice, tell them about the investment. We can settle this. I have the funds." Beatrice finally spoke, her voice carrying across the silent room. "There are no funds, Silas. I checked the offshore accounts an hour ago. They're empty. Elena moved them back to the corporate escrow where they belong." She turned to the board chair. "As of this moment, I am voting my shares to remove him as CEO, effective immediately." One by one, the board members stood. It was a silent, synchronized execution. They didn't look at the man they had feared for decades. They looked at the district attorney. Elena Vance stepped out from behind a marble pillar near the exit. She hadn't left. She had stayed to see the final blow land. She watched as the metal cuffs snapped shut over her father's wrists, a sharp, clinical sound that cut through his frantic excuses. He looked at her then, his eyes bloodshot, his face a mask of purple-veined fury. "I made you," he hissed as the officers led him down the stage stairs, past the tables of people who were already deleting his contact information from their phones. "You are nothing without my name. You'll be back on the street within a month." Elena stepped into his path, her shadow falling over him. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply reached out and adjusted his crooked tie with a mocking gentleness. "You didn't make me, Silas. You just provided the friction I needed to sharpen myself. And as for the name, you can keep it. I've already filed the paperwork to go back to my mother, S." She turned her back on him before he could respond, her heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm against the marble floor. Behind her, the sound of the crowd rising in a fever of gossip filled the hall, but she didn't look back. She walked out into the cool night air, leaving the ghost of the Vance empire to crumble in the dark. Silas was dragged toward a waiting cruiser, his protests lost in the wind, his world reduced to the four walls of a backseat. Elena stopped at the top of the stairs, taking a deep breath of the rain-washed air, finally free of the shadow that had darkened her life for 30 years. 6 months had passed since the dust settled on the ruins of the Vance empire. The transition hadn't been a quiet one. The tabloids had feasted on the remains for weeks, dissecting every fraudulent transaction and every broken promise Silas Vance had ever made. But for Elena, the noise had finally faded into a productive, rhythmic silence. She stood in the center of her new architectural studio, the scent of fresh cedar and expensive ink filling the air. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the blueprints spread across a reclaimed oak table. This wasn't the cold, sterile marble of the Vance headquarters. It was warm. It was hers. Julian Thorne leaned against the doorframe, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching her work with that quiet, grounding presence that had become her anchor. He had traded his carpenter's flannel for a structured charcoal blazer, though he still carried the faint scent of pine shavings. "The board for the museum project just called," Julian said, stepping into the room. He set a cup down near her elbow, careful not to smudge the ink. "They want to move the groundbreaking up to next month. They're calling it the most anticipated design of the decade." Elena took a slow sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't Elena Vance anymore, at least not on paper. She had legally reclaimed her mother's maiden name, and with it, a sense of identity that didn't feel like a cage. "It's a good start," she murmured. "But it's just one building, Julian." "It's more than that," he countered softly. "It's a legacy that isn't built on someone else's blood." Her phone buzzed on the table, a notification from a legal firm she hadn't heard from in weeks. It was a final status report on the liquidation of the Vance estate. She swiped it open, her eyes skimming the cold, hard numbers. The mansion was gone, sold at auction to a holding company. The private jets, the art collection, the offshore accounts, all seized or drained to pay back the creditors Silas had spent 30 years deceiving. Later that afternoon, she found herself sitting behind a thick pane of plexiglass in a facility that smelled of industrial bleach and old floor wax. The transition from her sun-drenched studio to this gray, windowless box was jarring. When Silas Vance was led into the room, she almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once commanded rooms with a single look now seemed swallowed by his orange jumpsuit. His hair, once a sharp, silver mane, was thin and dull. His hands trembled as he picked up the receiver. "You look well, Elena," he said, his voice a raspy shadow of the roar it used to be. Even now, in the wreckage of his life, his eyes searched for a weakness, a crack he could exploit. "I suppose you're enjoying the view from the top. It's a long way to fall, you know." "I'm not at the top, Silas," she replied, her voice steady and devoid of the anger that used to consume her. "I'm just on solid ground. There's a difference." He let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Solid ground, you think you got there on your own. You're a Vance. You have my ruthlessness in your veins. You used me to get what you wanted, just like I used everyone else. I'm proud of you in a way." The rage spike hit her, but it didn't boil over. It was a cold, sharp reminder of why she was here. I didn't use you. I stopped you. And if you think this was about pride, you're still not listening. You're alone because you treated people like chess pieces. Leo is in a state-funded rehab in Florida, and Beatrice hasn't answered a single one of your letters. Did you know that? The flicker of bravado in his eyes died, replaced by a hollow, haunting emptiness. He looked down at his shackled wrists. Leo was always weak, and Beatrice, she never understood the sacrifices I made. There were no sacrifices, Silas, only thefts, Elena said. She stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum. Martha Higgins passed away last week. She died in a quiet room with flowers on the table, knowing the truth was out. I thought you should know. She was the last person who ever truly cared about the man you were supposed to be. She hung up the receiver before he could respond. Through the glass, she watched his mouth open and close, a silent plea or perhaps another lie forming, but she didn't stay to hear it. She walked out through the heavy security doors, the cold air of the late afternoon hitting her face like a benediction. Julian was waiting by the car, the engine idling. As they drove away from the facility, Elena looked back at the gray concrete walls shrinking in the rearview mirror. She had won. She had her firm, her name, and her freedom. But as she looked at her hands, she realized the cost. The Vance name was a blackened husk, her brother was a broken man, and the family she had once dreamed of protecting was gone forever. She reached out and took Julian's hand, her fingers locking with his. The victory was absolute, but it was heavy. She was the last one standing in a field of ghosts, finally free to build something new, even if she had to do it on the ashes of everything she had once known.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.